We've heard a lot in the media about Baltimore and the violence in Baltimore. And when reporters talk about violence in Baltimore, they are talking about the population they describe as rioters. Now, here's the problem with that. It's not that violence among community members is acceptable. It's not that destruction of private property is acceptable. It's none of that. It's that we're only looking at the three-dimensional problem of violence in one dimension. Here's what I mean by that. There are three forms of violence in our society today. There is individual or community violence, human violence. There is state violence, that is violence that is committed either in the name of the state or with the resources of the state behind it. And we're using state in a broader sense to mean a state, a nation, and so on. And then there is structural violence. And structural violence is the kind that causes human injury and death, but over extended periods of time in a way that may not be visible to the majority of the population. When we watch the coverage of Baltimore, as we did during this past week, what we have seen is a one-dimensional view of community and individual violence alone. That is why the mother who slapped her child becomes iconic, because we see and repeated over and over again in media broadcast, because this is a way of saying this is just an individual moral failing on the part of these young people who are participating in the violence, and therefore what they need is better parenting. In other words, it's a way of saying, I, as someone who is not a member of those communities, am not to blame. If they were better parents, better children, better students, none of this would be happening. That is an extremely biased way of looking at the system and the process. Here's what I mean by that. Let's go one level up to state violence, violence committed either in the name of the state and at the order of the state, or with the state's tolerance, or somewhere in between. Now, as many people know who have covered this story, the Baltimore Sun did an excellent piece last year called Undue Force on the rampant police brutality in the Baltimore system. Now, they point out in the Baltimore Sun that the city paid about $5.7 million since 2011 alone from lawsuits claiming that police officers wantonly and incorrectly beat up citizens, or as the Sun describes it, alleged suspects. Now, that obviously, as the Sun points out, poisons the relationship between residents and police. Of course it does. And death certainly has that effect as well. Now, we're not just talking about the young males who are the subject of unjust or inappropriate police violence, although there is certainly that. But victims have also included older people, including a woman who I believe was 87 years old. It also included children. It included people basically of every description within that community. Now, why is that bad? That shouldn't be a question that gets asked, but it is. It's, of course, it's bad for a variety of reasons. One, you have a population basically terrorized, aware that it is capable of being subject to brutal state violence at any time. Now, why do I keep calling it state violence? Aren't these just bad cops, and aren't there good cops? And isn't it wrong to say that that's official police force business? Here's why we say that. Because the level of individual punishment for police officers who break the law and commit acts of violence against suspects is low to non-existent, because they have the resources of the state on their side. Because throughout the country, we see in the deaths of innocent young black people and in these acts of violence in Baltimore, which is an especially egregious police department, there is little to no punishment in both cases. That makes it state violence. Now, when you have a population who lives in fear of the state and the agents of the state it most frequently sees, which are the police officer who patrol its streets, you have a recipe for trouble. They cannot count on those individual police officers to protect them. They cannot go to those police officers for help, and they live in fear of them on a daily basis. When you have the kind of violence that resulted in the death of Freddie Gray, it becomes explosive. Now, let's add to that the level of institutional or structural violence which the folks in these communities are also struggling with. I've been reviewing the Health Disparities report card for Baltimore. Baltimore City has experienced improvements in the mortality rates in several major health indicators, but still an individual, and this includes the more prosperous and whiter sections of Baltimore, a resident of Baltimore still, Baltimore rather as a whole, still has a mortality rate that is 34% higher than Maryland as a whole. And when those disparities are broken down by race, they become even more extreme. There are health maps available of the city of Baltimore that are basically maps to the minority areas within the city. It is outrageous that people's lifespans are being affected by these health disparities, that homicide rates are much higher in these communities, and of course estrangement from the police makes it more difficult to get that problem under control, and that people's level of disability and illness is also so much higher for minority populations. So you have a population basically under siege through hunger, under siege through malnutrition, under siege through lack of adequate housing, under siege through lack of jobs, under siege through lack of health. That is causing deaths too on a daily basis, but they do not make the newspapers because they appear to be of natural causes. That is natural violence. That is structural violence that needs to be dealt with because it takes a toll on the people and leads to explosions like the ones we have seen in Baltimore and could see in many other cities as well. And I'll close with this. We also saw curfews this week, and we also saw the eerie sight of an Orioles game being played, the Orioles versus the White Sox, with nobody in the stands, 45,000 seats, nobody in them. Now that is the sign of a city whose social life has been profoundly disrupted and yet is pretending to continue with normal life. I would argue, I hope I'm not stretching a point too far, it's a metaphor for some of the economic disparities our society faces. It is a 1% baseball game, free to make its millions of dollars on advertising, on broadcasting, with none of the people of the community occupying the seats. Is that the future we want for our cities? Is that the future we want for our country? Is that the future we want for the young people of Baltimore? We ought to be talking about that. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.